Hello and welcome to the Wimbledon of Chess Tata Steel Chess tournament being held in Netherlands. In the second round, we had a lot of interesting matchups, but only two decisive games. Let's take a look at them and then we'll take a look at the overall standings after 2 days. So, and the game we're gonna start with Vladimir Fedoseev versus Vincent Keymer. If you checked out the first round of Tata Steel, Vladimir Fedoseev lost to Hans Niemann in just 16 moves. That was a very early drama, and unfortunately, yes, Vladimir ended up losing. But in the second game, he is looking towards actually beating one of the strongest players, the strongest seed, the first seed in this tournament, Vincent Keymer. And he starts with d4. We have knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. And we get Niemann Indian defense, queen c2, castle, knight f3, all very well-known theories, c5, d takes c5, knight goes to a6, and the idea is quite typical. So black take on c5 with knight, and their idea is to play knight f4 and then potentially damage the pawn structure and try to press the c4 and c3 pawns. So bishop g2, knight d4, bishop d2, knight d2, knight d2, so at least Vladimir avoided this knight c3 capture, and now a6. So the only problem I can see for black in foreseeable future is the development of this bishop on c8, because as you can see, this so-called Catalan bishop on g2 is preventing this bishop from development. So black will have to spend some time maybe playing rook b8, maybe even something like rook a7, and then play, let's say, b6, bishop b7, and that would be maybe the only way, because if you play d5, c takes d5, e takes d5, and this isolated pawn might become a problem. So what we can see is castle, rook b8, exactly, knight d4, knight d8, and c5. And as you may see, it's kind of tough to develop, because now, let's say b5, I don't see this happening. b6 is somewhat a good idea, but it wasn't played on the board. Queen c7 is one of the plans to immediately pressure c5 pawn, but instead, yes, queen c7, rook c1. And now the thing with bishop c5 is that after knight a4, it turns out that, you know, this bishop has to go, and let's say if it goes somewhere to d6, because this looks like it is protected, there's king d2, and this bishop is simply lost, and because the queen is under attack. So f5, queen b3, attacking the bishop, bishop a5, knight goes back to d2, and now b6. And here Vladimir played a banger, absolute banger. He plays knight d5. He's sacrificing his knight. He's sacrificing knight on d5. Two knights are under attack, but there's nothing good that you know, black can do, because let's say if queen d8, let's say he doesn't accept the sacrifice, knight c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop has to do something, and bishop g7, knight d b6. Why take the pawn back? I have an insane advantage. So instead we had e takes d5, queen d5, and after rook f7, c takes b6, queen b6, knight c4, and white take the bishop back. So bishop b7, knight b6, takes, and as you might see, of course, this bishop and this knight will be a lot better than this bishop on a5 and knight on e8, as it's too passive. Rook goes to c5, rook b5, rook c1, knight d6, and from now on Vladimir demonstrated a great technique. As you might see, Vincent didn't have a lot of time on the clock as well. So rook d4, takes, knight d5, g4, two pass pawns are about to be created, f4, and very soon after rook d3, Vincent admitted his loss and resigned. In the first round, if you think about it, Vincent played against Anish Giri, and they had a quick game because Anish basically blundered, you know, double attack and ended up losing. And now Vladimir, who quickly lost in the first round, takes, you know, the point back and beats the first seed. I mean, yes, great game for Vladimir, not a good game for Vincent. But now let's take a look at the Nodirbek Abdusattorov and Pragg. So Nodirbek drew in the first game against Turkish prodigy Yagis Kanardokmos. And Pragg in the first game actually ended up losing to Arjun Erigasi. And let's see what happened in this game. And once again, we have d4 on the board. d5, c4, e6, knight f3, knight f6, and knight c3. h6 is not a very common move. I mean, people play bishop b4 going for a Gaussian, people play something like maybe c6, knight bd7, even a6. h6, yes, h6 is somewhat like, let's say, something that Magnus would play, but I guess h6 is a good idea to stop bishop g5 from happening. So let's say after c takes d5, e takes d5, you know, black avoid Carlsbad structures with bishop g5, but bishop can always go to f4, and that's exactly what happened. But now this move is met with bishop d6, takes, and we get a very, very boring position. Like, you look at it and you're like, most of the time these games would end in a draw, especially in the top level GM game. But let's see what happens. I mean, 2 knights versus 2 knights. There's not a lot of pieces that are left. Yes, white can have this little pressure, but it's not that much. So knight d7, castle rook b8, a4, c6, a5, creating some, you know, potential weaknesses. I mean, b6, b5 are not really playable. I mean, you might potentially do it, but the idea maybe for white is to some point try to fight for c5 square. Maybe push rook b1 b4, I don't know. I mean, just 6, knight f3, now king goes to a3, trying to get to the endgame, a6, b5, and now takes, and once again, we're transposing to an endgame where, I mean, you just gotta be extremely careful. Yes, and once again, I would tell you that c6 pawn might become a huge weakness, but again, knight a4, knight e1, takes, and now we get to the following endgame where it's complete draw according to the engine, but of course we see players play on f3, knight c4. So here it's actually a smart move, because after takes, white eventually will have to sacrifice the knight back and probably trade pawns somehow, this pawn for one of this. So but instead what we saw in the game was knight c4, king f2, knight a5, attack on b3, rook c1, rook c7. So at this very moment, Pragg is up a pawn. So he plays d4, rook a7, knight c5 takes, and we get the following game where, I mean, just a move ago, black were up a pawn, and now white are up a pawn. Rook c6, rook e8, king f6, king f3, b3, a7, rook c7, and this position is a theoretical draw. So king f4, rook b7, rook b8, rook a7, rook b3, and rook b2. Like, yes, computer says it's like zeros, but from human standpoint, yeah, you might play this song, you might win, but I mean, white are not risking anything. They might go and play this song while you know, yes, black will have to defend, and if they find the best move, of course, it's gonna be a draw. So rook g2 is already kind of bad move because it allowed f4. So king e6, once again, tough to understand why it is the best move. King e7 is one of the options as well. But after rook g2 f4, pawn on g3 is protected. King e6, d5, and now rook b6, rook b7, rook goes back, king e7, and f5. So g takes f5. So if rook e2 was to be played, there is king f4, and I believe after rook f2, with the idea of maybe king g5, rook f5, there is rook f3, and now it takes, and this is basically a lost pawn endgame, because king f4, king d6, king f5, king g5, and king g5 is enough to win the game. So g takes f5, king f5, rook e3, rook e5, king f6, rook h5, threatening checkmate, rook f3, takes, now king goes forward, rook e1, king is cut off, e6, king d5, and Pragg resigned. The reason for resignation is, let's say, if rook c2, there is d7, and rook d2, king e6 can be played, king c6 might be played as well, just because rook c6, king d6, rook d2, I mean, you can play king e6 at this moment, who cares? Because basically what's coming is, let's say king g7, king d7, rook, let's say if rook stays here, there is rook f1, rook e3, and you can play king f6, you can play king d6. I mean, you can probably take at this moment, and then the idea is rook d3, king e6, king g7, king goes Maybe rook f5. Yes, rook f5, building the bridge, rook f3, rook e5, rook f3, rook d5, rook f3, king d6, one promotes, and white wins. So let's take a look at the standings after 2 days. Hans is at 1.5, Nodirbek 1.5, and Arjun 1.5. Gukesh, Fedoseev, Van Forest, Arvin, Matthias Bluebaum, Taidan Yen, Yegis, Yava here, Vincent are at 1 point. Anish at half a point because he lost in the first game and then he drew against Sindarov, and we have Pragg who lost first 2 games. Pragg actually is the winner of the tournament played in 2025. He beat Gukesh on tiebreak, so let's see how this tournament goes for him. I mean, 2-0 is a tough start, but I think he has somewhat good pairing round number 3 with white piece against Taidan Yen, and then he has Gukesh, Anish, which would be quite tough games. Hopefully he doesn't tilt. So that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed. Let me know any questions you might have, and I'll see you after round number 3. Bye bye.